Hello, this BTEC Sport and Exercise Science video is for Functional Anatomy, which is Unit 2. We are looking at some exam guidance again, so we are looking now at how to write a question 11 answer and to get the right level of quality to get you a great grade. Just to remind you, this is what question 11 looks like. You'll get an image, it's for 8 marks. The question is always phrased in the same way. It directs you to what bits of the skeleton it wants you to consider or analyse, and the 3 joints it wants you to specifically analyse. And it will always ask you to move from one position to another, just one analysis. This is our Sexy Justin Bieber acronym to provide us with a way of remembering and checking that we include the right information. So remember, I'm encouraging you to, as an absolute minimum, include the factual information about cake. So the basic ingredients of the cake. What part of the skeleton, what classification, what type of synovial joint, what bones make up the joint, what movement's happening in what plane. But I really want you to incorporate a splattering of icing throughout each of your joint analyses, and that might include this information. Here is the plan for this squat question 11 analysis. And so what I want to show you in this video briefly is how to construct an answer. And it's basically, you've done the hard work because you've got what you've got to write about. And now I just want to show you perhaps a writing frame and a way to approach the question. So, this is a suggestion, purely that, of how you might approach a paragraph, one analysis of one of the joints. And of course you can replicate this structure for each of the 3 joints. Just note this is just cake, most basic ingredients. There's no extra show-off information here. This is the ultimate minimum that you must have. So we know we've got to account for Sexy Justin Bieber, we know we've got to account for skeleton, joints, bones, planes and movements. In green, what I've added here though is a reference to the question, a link to the question, because the examiners really want you to make sure you analyse the movement in the question, not just give bare facts. So it's important for you, through each of your joint analysis to link it to the movement that's happening in the picture that they want you to discuss. So I've just put here, to move from standing to squat position, the athlete engages the hip to lower their body in the squat action. So I've just made sense of the movement linked to the hip joint. Then what you're going to do is you're going to say, you've got to acknowledge what part of the skeleton this joint is in. So the hip joint is part of the appendicular skeleton, for example. Then you've got to do the joint content. So this is 2 things, if you remember. This is accounting for the classification of joint. Is it fibrous, cartilaginous or synovial? And if it is synovial, you've got to also account for which type of synovial joint is it. So you might write here, it is a cartilaginous joint, full stop. Or you might write here, it is a synovial pivot joint, and I've put those 2 together, synovial being the classification, pivot being the type of synovial joint that it is. And I think that's a good way to go about it. So I'd like you to write synovial ball and socket, synovial hinge joint. Then we've got to account for the bones that make up that joint. So I've put 2 here. There may be more than 2 bones that articulate at a joint. There are definitely in some cases. But you could write the femur and tibia are the articulating bones, or the ilium or pelvis and femur are the articulating bones. Lastly, you've got to account for what movement is happening in what plane. So these 2, as I've said, go together. Movements happen in our plane. The movement created is flexion in the sagittal plane. The movement created is rotation in the transverse plane, whatever it happens to be for your joint. Of course, please note there are no muscular system analyses at all in question 11. They are only present in question 12. Question 11 is just about the skeletal system. So I've put together a basic cake writing frame with the answers in it in red. So we've got our green, refer to the question. We've got our statement about skeleton, it's part of the appendicular skeleton. The hip is a synovial ball and socket joint. is our two things: synovial classification, ball and socket type of synovial. The articulating bones are the ilium, which is part of the pelvis, and the femur. To be honest, that's a little bit of icing, but it's the pelvis and the femur are the main bones. In the downward face of the squat, I should have put that in green really because it refers to the question. The athlete flexes at the hip joint in the sagittal plane, or the hip flexes in the sagittal plane. So that's the movement and the plane. So that's your basic cake minimum ingredients content answer. What I'd like to do now is show you how you can build on that and add sprinklings of icing throughout your analysis and show off what you know. So let's have a look. Here is a cake and icing hip analysis paragraph. So exactly the same content, just be aware I've put the cake in blue and my icing is in red. Here's our reference to the question as always. So it's part of the appendicular skeleton, which is primarily long bones of the limbs that enable movement. So that's just a little bit of extra information about the function of the appendicular skeleton. I'm showing off. Joint type, it's a synovial ball and socket joint. We know that, that's our cake. Icing, which has the greatest range of movement and moves in all three planes, making it less stable. The ball and socket joint is made of a large round condyle of the femoral head, so the femur has a big condyle on the end, the ball, fitting into a fossa on the ilium, so the pelvis has a socket, and that's our ball and socket. So I'm showing off, I understand the structure of a ball and socket joint. The articulating bones are the ilium, which is part of the pelvis, and the femur. So the pelvis, bracket, showing off, is a flat bone, which are thin, but have a large surface area to protect sex organs and for muscle attachment. Femur, showing off icing, which is the largest long bone and acts as a lever for hip and leg movements. It's also key in producing red blood cells. So I'm just dropping in there structural, functional bits of information about the bones. Lastly then, in the downward phase of the squat, so that's our reference to the question, the athlete flexes at the hip joint in the sagittal plane. So I've defined flexion, reduction in the angle at the joint, and I've defined the sagittal plane, an imaginary flat surface that divides the body into left and right sides. If all of my movements are flexion and in the sagittal plane, do not define them every time. Once you've defined them once, don't repeat the same icing. Okay, so that's the hip joint analysis. Here is the knee joint analysis. So what I want you to do is pause the video, have a little look, just recognise what are my basic cake ingredients, where have I referred to the question, and what icing, what sort of icing have I given. And lastly, here is the ankle joint analysis for this squat action. Again, pause the video, read in your own time, what's the cake, what's the icing. So all I've done just to finish is I've put this completely together. This is my one answer. What I suggest you do when you write your answers is give a subtitle of the joint that you're writing about. Anything that makes it clearer to the examiners what you're doing, what you're writing about, what section is it, really helps them make sense of your answers actually. Please be aware that I've probably added in quite a lot of icing. You needn't add quite as much, but I'm trying to show you what you can do and how you can do it as we go along. So, just to finish then, let's just draw together the key things to be mindful of when you're writing and thinking about your cake and icing. Always link to the exam question context and describe the movement you must analyse. So the green in my answers was me referring to the question. Always do that in all of your paragraphs. Always use the acronym Sexy Justin Bieber Plays Music to literally tick off the required information for each joint. You'll have made a plan. You're going to have to make a plan for each joint analysis, but tick off once you've written about it. Because if you miss bits out, you risk missing, dropping down levels or marks. Always plan before you write. Even if, worst case scenario, let's say you ran out of time and you had done a plan, you could get credit for having correct information in your plan. So always plan. Plus, If you've done your thinking through and you've got your plan, and then you start writing, writing is so much easier than trying to think and write at the same time. So always plan before and then write. Don't repeat the same icing points. If you've defined something, if you've said it's in the, what the function of the appendicular skeleton is, please don't write the same icing in the next paragraph, in the next joint. Either pick out some different icing, but or don't write any other icing. Don't repeat the same. It's pointless, waste of your time. Vary what icing you write about. There are some topics where you can pick out lots of little things. The structure of bones, the structure of joints, the function of them, the movement that can happen, synovial components, so synovial membrane, ligaments, articular cartilage, the structure and function of the classifications. There's actually a lot you can write about with some of those topics. So in your 3 joints that you're going to analyse, pick out different icing points. I would probably coach you, certainly initially, to write your icing in brackets. It makes it really clear what are your basic facts and what's your extra stuff. In order to get good marks for question 11 and question 12, you've got to know your skeletal content really, really well. Once you know that really well, you can chuck out loads of icing content, but it's about knowing your skeletal system content. So that's it. We've kind of gone through how to interpret the question 11, how to plan for it, and how to write it, in making sure we include as a minimum the cake, but ideally including snippets of icing throughout each of your 3 joint analyses to get you really great marks.